And I'm here to talk to you about a lot of different things. First of all, I'll introduce myself. I have a tendency to just jump right into the topic, so I always kind of leave some space for myself. Say hi, Twyla. Say hello to everybody. I want to introduce myself in my traditional language, and so I'll say Dosha, Madanakpago, Madishinia Maadawish. My name is Twyla Baker, and I am a citizen of the Mandan Hidatsa and Arikara Nation in Northwest North Dakota. I was born and raised on the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation, and um, I spent my formative years there going to school. And I ended up leaving the reservation for quite some time to go and pursue all those degrees that you just heard. And now I'm back home working for my tribe and working for my people as the president of our tribal college in the Nuitahiratsa Sahnishkam. I think my background, my experience, and the work that I do in my day to day is really formed and driven by my identity as an Indigenous woman. And um, a lot of that development in regards to my leadership came from the fact that I was a citizen of my tribe. And I spend a lot of time doing exactly what I'm doing right now, talking to people about Indigenous education overall, and in particular in STEM education, because that's where I got my start. I got my start. I was kind of the nerdy gal, uh, doing the science projects and engaging with the science club, going to science fairs and things like that. And pretty soon it turned into a academic path for me. And I ended up going to school for environmental geology and technology, and spent a great deal of time with other nerds like me, other Indigenous nerds, so to speak. And I engaged, and I was basically kind of pulled into this community of Indigenous people who were working in STEM, who were studying STEM, and who were just doing different things in Indian country in regards to their various careers. And it's been basically the blessing of my life to be able to say that I have a family within that community, and they really support me and they support the work that we do, um, engaging young people and Indigenous young people in particular in STEM. So that's my introduction for myself. There's my baby picture. Just wanted to, and this is the point where started telling my story. I started talking about um, where I come from, and I share this particular picture because one, I really like that outfit that I have on there, and my mom made it. My mom actually made it, and for number two, the fact is my mom made it. She had to make it. I had a lot of outfits kind of like that she made, and not necessarily because she was particularly crafty or anything like that. She was really good at that kind of thing, but out of necessity too. I come from a space of um, um, I'm gonna say poverty and all of those kind of like stereotypical type things that you've heard about Indigenous communities and things like that. I had a really strong mother and father, and uh, the I think it's important, and it's always important for me as an Indigenous person speaking to other Indigenous people, particularly to our young people, to let them know that I came from a place that they know, that they know intimately and that they're familiar with. I came from the reservation, grew up on a reservation, and I am now I'm just kind of doing my thing from anywhere, and do this type of work and really thrive in it. Uh, the field is wide open in regards to STEM, and you really don't know what type of path you're going to end up taking when you start on your academic journey. So I typically start my talks with this particular question. Um, and this is really pointed at, for one thing, and for another, it's also something for educators and people who would be mentors to those who are coming up in STEM to be thinking about. And it ties pretty well to culture, and uh, it's really just kind of something to get these young people thinking and start kind of taking tally of what it is and why it is they want to pursue this particular field, whatever field that they happen to be engaging with in STEM. And to read it off to you, because it's in my doctoral scrawl there, it's what are the gifts imparted to you by your culture, your society, where you come from, and what are your responsibilities to honor? And I will ask my students to consider this question, this series of questions here. It's kind of complicated. And to start making lists, start keeping track of what it is that they feel they bring to the table, uh, it- whether they're studying STEM or if they're going into a different field. What is it that you bring? What is it, what part of your identity do you bring to your academic journey, and though what is your responsibility in regards to sharing those gifts with other people? How do you honor those gifts? And I talk about gifts a lot with folks because quite honestly, I spend, like I said, I spend a lot of my time doing this type of work, talking about indigeneity in the wider culture, and it's almost an act of rebellion to be indigenous and to really inhabit who I am in these spaces, because these spaces were not created for us. This is a very, very Western um, uh, Western viewpoint and the Western workplaces that we end up functioning in. But I find that the students that I work with, they want to bring their whole selves to the table. They want to bring their whole selves to the workplace. And that's what has become basically kind of like my bread and butter in regards to what I can contribute to society in this workplace. So I do want folks to be thinking about this question, and we can maybe talk about that later on in the Slack channel. And you can start sharing about what it is that you bring when you are thinking about your role and your life path. So okay, so now I think I may have spoken about this already, and I'm sure there's gonna that will be addressing some of this later on. But what I deal with personally, and what I also see amongst my student syndrome, the the difficulty or the feeling of being a mismatch, or not necessarily feeling that you are in a space where you belong, or that you necessarily are comfortable occupying. And really, I think one of the things that I can convey to, and really to professionals too, indigenous professionals in industry or wherever, is that everybody feels like that. Everybody kind of has that sense that, well, maybe I'm not an exact fit. And in this little image kind of portrays it pretty well. All these folks walking around, all think having the same thought that, everybody else has it all together, and what am I doing? What's the deal with me? And I feel my role as a Native academic, Native scientist, is not just to role model what it is that I've done in the past, but to really share and to connect with students, those young folks that are coming up, and help them to understand that I was exactly where they were some years back, and also to connect with like my colleagues, and help them to understand as well their responsibility, the privilege it is to really occupy these spaces for one thing, and how it's powerful for them to just be be there when you consider the history of Indigenous people on Turtle Island, what we call Turtle Island. So I'll talk more about that there. Okay, so I was talking about bread and butter, and this is an idea. This is an idea that I've actually been working on, and I'm attempting to get it out there in publication. This is what I do for a living, basically. It was something that really came across during a conversation that I was having with a bunch of other Indigenous professionals. Um, we were talking about the work that we do, and I'm like literally kind of doing it right now. No fault to anybody. This is just what happens. Indigenous professionals end up with a degree of translation exhaustion because, well, there's a the erasure that happens of our history and how we got to where we are, how our communities um, ended up where they are now, the language that we use, the references that we make, what happens to us in the modern day, all of that is a bit of translation that we end up having to do as Indigenous academics, helping folks to understand how to connect to an Indigenous student, how to connect with a Native community. And I, I don't, it doesn't bother me at all because this is basically what I get paid to do. I talk Indigenous experience. And we just needed to get our arms around the idea, myself and my colleagues, and put a name to it. And that helped people to, it's good to have a name for something that somebody might be having difficulty with. But it's just the idea that Indigenous people or any marginalized person or group, I had intended for this, engaging with the larger population on a given subject or topic related to bias must first set the stage in terms of today's state of affairs before even addressing said topic of bias. Over and over again, due to the lack of education or background that the listener has. That's a direct impact of the Indigenous history beyond the cursory mention in school systems. And quite honestly, that's just an effect. That's an effect of what what we what we have to deal with. And when we're talking about um, well, when I'm talking about it is that I'm talking to understands that in order to connect to these young people, you have to understand their history, their communities, and where they come from. And I think that's exactly why I do what I do as a tribal college president. And that's why we, as tribal colleges, are very successful in connecting with these students. They need to feel a sense of belonging. They need to feel a sense of understanding in order to be able to engage. And um, there are other institutions that are actually really good at this too. There's non-tribal colleges that have Native American studies programs that have a lot of spaces and feel understood, welcomed, and to feel that sense of belonging. And it's not just necessary, it's crucial in order for them to be successful in any program, not just STEM programs, but all programs. I talk about this in Indian country that address this issue in particular. And I think about one in particular, of course, American Indian Science and Engineering species. Hopefully there's folks on that are watching right now because they actually kind of sent this out, the invitation to students and stuff to engage and to watch. But it's an organization with the express mission of increasing the number of Native Americans, Native Hawaiians, Alaska Natives that are in STEM. and it really gives people a place to belong. And I'll probably talk about ACEs a little bit more because I've been involved with ACEs since I was, I think, an eighth grader. So I'll talk about that a little bit more. Okay, so to understand Indigenous communities and our education systems and where they came from, you kind of have to understand a viewpoint that isn't necessarily a true one. A lot of the time when people talk about Indigenous communities, they're talking about them from a from a viewpoint or perspective, uh, westernized eyes, a viewpoint of lack, basically stating that Indigenous students lack this or they lack that, they don't have something, lack access, or all those types of things. And I function within that system, all the time, all the time. I live and I work in Indian country. Indian country is actually a term like you can look up in the dictionary. Indian country describes like the land that federally recognized tribes hold and they occupy in the U.S. At any rate, the the idea of lack has always been one that has bothered me as a person who grew up in these communities, as a tribal member, and as somebody who has a strong sense of identity. Um, I grew up not necessarily knowing that I lacked anything. All of those things that you heard about in regards to lack, like, oh, well, the stereotypes of the poor Indian, the alcoholic Indian, all of those types of things. I didn't really see that, nor did I feel it. Um, it took me a little while to understand as I got older what it was that actually filled up that space for me. And what it was that sense of identity and belonging and knowing who I was as an Indigenous woman and as an Indigenous person, and having a community that claimed me, having a community truly provided me with all of those things, with that cultural capital is what I call it, to shield me when things got difficult. And having been given those gifts, um, I took it on later on to start conveying that idea to other people, to young people in particular, to my students, to my colleagues, that they also possess those things, whether they were connected or if they were disconnected too, and that happens a lot too. There's kind of like layers of indigeneity. There's degrees, so to speak, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. Um, we I want to say that I was able to draw my strength from those spaces and from that understanding of who I was in order to do the work and to remember why I was doing the work, and to be able to have the drive and understanding and coming back to my calculus classes, coming back to my chemistry classes, and all of those types of things. So I didn't function in that place of lack. I what I understood was that I came from a place of bounty, and I was able to use those strengths and tap into that cultural capital when I got tired, when I got, kind of beat down by finals, or when my dissertation was looming and I was kind of like, oh my gosh, am I crazy for doing all this stuff? That type of thing. I was able to tap into my purpose and to my culture. And I to this day, that's what I do. I go back to what it is and the reason why I do the work that I do. And there's a whole lot of cultural ties that kind of go along with that in regards to what I do and what I've been asked to do by my people. Okay. And this is exactly what I'm talking about, crafting your strength. Sometimes you have to come from a place. It, Students can feel as if they are alone when they're attempting to connect in an alien environment. And if you have Indigenous students that are coming from a small community or anything like that, that can be quite the culture shift for them. That can be quite the shock to the system for them. And in um, a way to support those students is to give them a place to belong, for one thing, and to provide that support for them, but also to remind them of that strength. And that's one of the reasons why I go around doing these types of talks, is letting them know that they don't necessarily have to just rely upon themselves. There are communities that they can tap into to draw strength from, and I just threw that photo up there. That's my group of ladies. Shortly after we did the Missing and Murdered Indigenous in February of this year, and I draw a lot of strength. And I know a lot of my younger students and student groups and such on campus do the same thing. They draw strength from their communities, from these sisterhoods, from these, you know, this brotherhoods or whatever the culture and things. So providing that network for them is so crucial and so important, and it's so critical for the success of Indigenous students that they are reminded every day of how strong they are, and that how worthy they are as well. So I'm sharing a picture here of my college, and that's my little tribe in Northwest North Dakota. And the tribal college movement in and of itself is very young. We are the youngest institutions of higher education in the United States. We're around about 50, 55 years old, haven't been around for too terribly long, but it's been an enormous movement. There are 37 tribal colleges across the United States, and we are primarily located in very rural areas on reservations, and we serve students who um, might not have the opportunity to have higher education otherwise. Those students that are basically kind of either returning from institutions where they didn't necessarily feel the connection or anything like that, or maybe students that are working, students that have kids. We have any number of different circumstances that our students have to deal with, rurality being one of them. I live way, way out. I don't know if people can even understand how rural parts of North Dakota are. That I have to actually drive around and search for Wi-Fi and things. It's always an interesting conversation to convey to folks the context that I live and I work in, and because they don't necessarily have a frame of reference for that. Uh, so I invite people to my campus, or I invite people out to the reservation to come and visit, because my homelands, I love my homelands. They're beautiful. I think they're gorgeous. And but you have to kind of want to get there. It's not on the way to anywhere. So you have to be intentional about going to Newtown, North Dakota, or to Fort Berthold, North Dakota. Um, Again, the tribal colleges are very young, but we have this enormous legacy of working in STEM. We do a lot of different things. We do a lot of different type of work. We partner with larger institutions. We have, like, my college itself has this fantastic relationship with the North Dakota State University in Fargo. I'm actually in Fargo right now. Um, we share ideas, we do projects together, we do a lot of different things. We've got a PEAK program, which is the pre-engineering program. We've also got a sustainable energy program. If you look at the photo there, that's my little wind turbine, and that's the only one in the city of Newtown right now. That's renewable energy, and it's pumping that energy back into pretty soon in the relatively near future. There's going to be solar panels on top of my college there. It's the work that I do is basically the blessing on my life. I love what I do. Um, I was talking about now. I don't know if you guys are gonna even understand that meme there, but Indigenous people probably will. I was talking about strength and where we draw our strength and our history and things like that. And I just wanted to share some photos of our culture. And I was talking about that drive from culture. These are my brothers, the short bull drum. I am absolutely an academic and a scientist, but I am also a woman of my people, and I am. There's no For me. There's no longer a walking in two worlds. I hear that all the time, and it really kind of always rubbed me the wrong way because it kind of to me made this uh, inference that I had to be there was a duality, like I was one person in one space and I'm another person in another space, and that's not how it is. I am who I am. I am a woman of the MHA Nation everywhere I go. And one of the things that I like to do is dispel the idea that I have to basically not be me when I'm or in research spaces or anything like that. No, that's just not how it is. The meme on the right hand side you is another source of strength, and that's our culture is really funny. Our people are incredibly funny, and that it's probably only a joke that like the any indigenous listeners might understand, but it's another space where we draw our sense of community and belonging. And I can say that there the whole idea of stoic Indian, the cigar store wooden Indian, um, I don't know those people. Indigenous people are incredibly funny and warm and welcoming, and that's the people that I know, and that's where I go back to all the time. Okay, so I'm going to tell a short story here um, about history and why it's important to remember history and to have that understanding of where you are. Wherever you go in the United States, you are on Indian land, and it's good to understand and to look and find out whose traditional homelands you happen to be standing on. This photo is infamous in my community. This is actually our tribal chairman in the 1940s signing the act that gave away, I think it's like 100 and some thousand acres of prime bottomland, our land, to be flooded during the Garrison Dam, during the building of the Garrison Dam. And it's important to me because it's a marker in history of the what I'm up against, basically, what I'm dealing with in regards to working on Fort Berthold and working for my people, because that lake is still there. This happened. There's a historical trauma that goes along with this, and my students carry that historical trauma. And I also like to convey to other educators, to other people working with Indigenous populations, that this is not something that's historic. This does not live in antiquity. These things happen to our people, and they very much so have impacts that make themselves known today. And I share this photo in particular because there's a gentleman here in red. That man is my grandfather. That's James Baker. He was the Independence Community Representative to our Tribal Business Council at that time, and he was present at that signing. So this guy is my dad's dad. That's how close this history is to me, and that to me, I think, is very telling of how history isn't really just way stuck way back there, get over it, that type of thing. It's not something that just lives in the past. It has impacts and it ripples. And I use that viewpoint, I use that perspective to help inform how I come across as an educator, how I make my decisions as an administrator for my college. And hopefully this type of understanding of that history is something that's helpful for anybody that happens to be listening. Okay, so now I'm sharing these photos. That's my horse. That's my horse Dandy, and my daughter. He just was stretching his face, and they happened to catch him when he looked like he was laughing. But anyway, uh, speaking of STEM, and there's this overarching understanding and uh, we have talks about Indigenous STEM on my campus and amongst my colleagues and such, about how there is not a sense of butting heads when we're talking about native science. It's more of like a crossover and an understanding of the natural world and how we occupy it and how our culture ties into it, and how you can be all of these things and you can have that existence and still be a scientist and still be a native person. On the left there is my beloved group, my the board of directors of American Indian Science and Engineering Society, of which I was a member for several years, and I was also their board chair. This is the largest organization for American Indian scientists and engineers in the country. And we have a national conference every year. We have regional conferences. We get together and we talk. We have committees and all these different types of things. There's lots and lots of things going on in regards to not just native STEM, but STEM overall, and our role in it as Indigenous people. The middle photo is of me, my students, and my dear friend Linda Black Elk at the Sacred Stone Camp of Tete during the protests there, and we were actually holding class at that time. Native STEM can kind of get a little bit drawn into just like indigenous existence, uh, into the struggles that we have, into the work that we do, um, exercising our sovereignty and our right to govern ourselves and our right to educate ourselves the way we see fit. So we were lucky enough to be able to take these students down to the camps, to Sacred Stone, and do a nature walk and do a medicine walk and walk around with Linda, who has an extensive knowledge of eco science and medicines, traditional medicines there, and we held class there. And this is how we function, and this is kind of, I think, what makes tribal colleges so incredibly unique, the way we work and the way we collaborate and the way we connect with our students. So, and Dandy is there because he's part of our equine studies program, and it's the only equine studies program in the nation. My little tribal college in North Dakota is the only equine studies program in the nation that has an indigenous focus. You can get a degree in equine studies with an indigenous focus, and we're working on getting like equine therapy for communities, particularly indigenous communities, and getting people out into those communities and doing that type of work. Very much so tied to what we do as scientists. We get support from external large institutions to do that type of work. So okay, now this is just a further portrayal of the work that we do. That gentleman in the middle there, he's very, very near and dear to my heart. He's a very dear friend of mine. That is Mr. John Harrington. He is the first Native American astronaut, and he's wearing a homemade ACES sweater. he actually sat on our ACES board. He just left the board recently. We term out and then we come back and we serve again and stuff. But John Harrington is very well known. But I think the thing that I love about John is that he is so incredibly down to earth and grounded and strong in his identity, and he connects with these students. So once you get this background, I always get this sense that it's like a cultural, I don't know if it's a cultural thing or not, but it feels like a responsibility to reach back and continue to pull these students along into this path and to help out our people. And those young ladies that are walking in their regalia there, they're actually at the career fair. They are at the career fair. They are allowed to bring their entire whole selves into these spaces, talking to Intel, talking to Raytheon, talking to other different spaces in industry, and getting job interviews and that type of thing. That's what ACES does. The berries there are intended to portray the work that we do as stewards of our traditional homelands. Indigenous people around the world protect 80% of the biodiversity that exists still on this planet. We steward that, and we need STEM in order to do that type of work. We've had STEM traditionally for millennia. I think that's one message that we kind of skip over a lot, is that we were the first scientists that existed on this continent, and we, through trial error, observation, all of those things, they all existed here. We might have called them something different, but we did all that work, and then Western education kind of came and told us that we weren't necessarily scientists, at least within their view. Now we're kind of pushing back, and we're saying, oh, wait a minute, we gave you guys a lot of the medicines that you use, we gave you a lot of the foods that you use, we did food science, we did genetics, we did all kinds of different things way before y'all got here. So, and that's just a portrayal of that's at the ACES conference, and that's my very dear friend who actually works for ACES now. And the only reason I put the photo there of the resistance, that's at the Sacred Stone Camp, is because I've always felt that occupying who I am and then being a scientist almost is like a resistance. It's like being in the resistance. And lately it feels like just being a scientist period is part of being the resistance. but it's been there for us for quite some time, to go and to get all these degrees and these programs and all these other things, and to be able to create that for our people back at home. That's us going and taking what was intended to absent us of our identity, and then using it to carry on our legacy, to carry on our DNA memory. And so I'm always extremely fortified and very, very happy and proud when I see our young people resisting that way, persisting, learning and understanding and growing, and then succeeding within those spheres and those realms. And it's, I love that work. So um, now I'm talking about culture shift. At the very beginning, we talked about culture shift, and in order for us to, as educators, as professionals, to continue to create this space where all people feel welcomed in STEM, in any field, really, we have to continue to have these courageous conversations. We have to continue to call out history and remind folks of where these institutions came from, and that not all of these institutions or the way that people are taught works for everyone. But we still got to make space for them. We still have to advocate for those who don't necessarily connect the way everyone else does. Now, and the way I do that is to remind folks that we had been, at least from my perspective as an Indigenous person, we had been educating our people for millennia prior to the introduction of Western education. We'd already been doing it. So why is it necessary to move away from that model? So now it's my job to continue to return or revitalize or revisit the traditional way of doing things and introduce them in a modern context. So hopefully that makes sense for people. We can definitely have that conversation later on in the Slack if you have questions about that, about having courageous conversations. And I feel like I typically have to convey or share with folks that there is space for you, there is space for our young people, educators, professionals. You are absolutely capable of connecting with Indigenous people. You might have Indigenous people around you that you aren't even aware of, because there are just, like I said, there's degrees of indigeneity. There's so much crossover or multiple identities within people anymore. not everybody who is Indigenous looks like me. You know, it's a brave new world. And hopefully folks are able and willing and have the energy to continue to make space, because these folks have so much to contribute to the world, and we have just um, such an enormous um, body of knowledge to share with the rest of the world. And quite honestly, I feel like it's time for the rest of the world to be tapping into that Indigenous knowledge, given the challenges that we have environmentally and in society. So let's see. Okay, I'm telling my dad's story now. And I'll do it quickly because I think I'm coming up on time. That's my father. He is 82 years old. Um, he's a boarding school student, and I'm not sure how many folks have knowledge or have heard about the boarding school experience in Indian country. He's alive and well. He lives in Bismarck, and I take care of him. And he's just an amazing fellow. His first language was Hidatsa. He was born and raised on the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation, and he ended up having to go to school in Pierre, South Dakota. When he was, I believe, 10 or 11 years old, he got taken to a boarding school in Pierre, South Dakota. And just by random chance, I was invited to Pierre, South Dakota this past fall, to the South Dakota Indian Education Association meeting to come and share on Indian education and tribal college's role in that. And it was so surreal to be in Pierre. And this is the school that he attended. It was just so strange for me to be there, because my dad didn't want to be there. He actually ran away from the school when he was a child. He attempted to walk home. He was just a little bitty guy. He was like 10, 11 years old, like I said, and he wanted to walk along the river and return home. Um, and he knew if he followed the Missouri River, which is just maybe a mile away from this building, that he would make it home eventually. He did not know as a child that it was 500 miles river, but he attempted anyway. Now, this gentleman made it for 2 weeks at that age. He he was he was gone from school for 2 weeks, and I don't know how far he made it, but he just kept following that river. He ate berries, he drank water from the river, and he slept in hay bales. And he at at the end of that time period, he got lost and he had to go to a farmer's house to get help. But and the farmer called the school and told them that, I've got a young man here who appears to be lost, and he might be from your school. And they came and got him, and he stayed there. He stayed at Pierre Indian School for the rest of his education. And he tells me this story and he laughs about it, and he tells it just so very nonchalantly, when I think to myself about, wow, being a little kid at that age, and what he's done. And he actually went on to get his degree. He got a bachelor's degree, and he was just this amazing fellow. He played basketball, and he was an All-American and all that stuff. And he was just an astonishing guy. And then, I mean, I think about what he had to face up to, and all of a sudden what I go through in the work that I do doesn't seem as difficult at all. And I think about what my students have to go through, and I'm reminded of my purpose. And I draw that strength from my dad. I also get it from my mom too, who was also a boarding school student. I guess I'm lucky in the most people wouldn't necessarily think that that's terribly lucky, but to have that legacy of strength and fortitude, resilience, and cultural knowledge, those are the gifts that I use to be able to do the work that I do, and to exist in these spaces where I'm multiple things, a lot of different things for a lot of different people. So that's my dad, and that's actually the river. That's the river that I stood next to this past fall. during my talk. That's in Pierce, South Dakota. That's the Missouri River, and I stood there where my dad went to boarding school, standing on the banks of this river as Dr. Baker, and it was just the most fortifying moment I think I've had for a very, very long time, and it's part of the reason I do the work that I do. So I'm actually going to skip this next slide uh, and come to the end here and revisit that question. We will talk about this later on in the Slack channel. And I would love to hear from all of you, knowing that I'm coming from a very, very strongly influenced by my culture space. Uh, it's not always about being an Indigenous person. It can be anything, any type of gift that you happen to have. You might be, you might be a woman. You might be a different other gender. You might be anywhere, any space. And if you are continuing on in this STEM journey, if you are working in STEM, if you are doing any type of that work, I want to know what it is that you are bringing to the table. I want to know how it is that you are staying strong in those spaces and how you are honoring your legacy, because believe it or not, you have a legacy. You have that strength, and somebody's watching you. Somebody is seeing what you're doing, and they are drawing strength from the path that you are creating for others. So I think I will conclude with that. And I have been, this has been just the greatest event that I've had so much fun with this. This is very, very new to me. So I'm pretty happy to have been invited. And I thank you all for your kind time and attention.
Yes, Dr. Twyla, y'all put your hands together for her. I think we have time for one question. One question. I'm gonna show my face real quick. You did a fantastic job. Let me ask you a question that has come in the Slack channel. I'm gonna give you opportunity to just answer it on live. Again, for those who don't know, Dr. Twyla is gonna be in the speaker chat for a little bit. So if you have any questions or want to connect with her, we got some people saying, "Oh, I can't wait. I want to meet Dr. Twyla." Olivia says that. People definitely are connecting with you. So let me find our speaker chat. So Manny asks, what similarities do you see between Indigenous people, Latinos, African Americans, etc., when it comes to lacking, and how do you think we can all work together to help each other out?
That's a great question. I think that the similarities are just, oh my gosh, there's just so many. There's so many. And when I connect with my colleagues who are of different nations, is what I call them, um, from those different spaces, the stories that we tell are so incredibly similar. Of coming from these spaces where we're told or we're somehow made to feel like we are less than, or that we don't necessarily have the tools to do this type of work. And we can always kind of distill it around a wider society and listening to those types of messages. And uh, this is another space of strength that I draw from and connect with people from other ethnic backgrounds, because our stories are so similar, of dispossession, of displacement, of all of that historical trauma, and uh, it's it's really heartening to be able to see movement together, to see people including other backgrounds into that struggle, and into really working towards equity and diversity and inclusion. And I actually engage in that a whole lot, and in a kind of official space too, with like Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and other different places that I do my work. And I'm so grateful for those relationships because they give me a perspective and an understanding that I don't necessarily have within my own space. So I'm always grateful, and I'm really glad to connect with people that have different backgrounds than I do.
That's